Every person, every place has their scars. Norrath is no exception. The chasm of the over there, the burning woods, the literal scars of Velius, and of course, the hole. And like any scar, it has a story to tell. Deep in the bowels of the earth lies an elaborate city, teeming with constructs, riches, ghosts, and the creatures of the underfoot that killed them. And Kern. Hi, Kern. Just how did such an advanced city end up abandoned at the bottom of this cavernous pit? Well, the short answer is erudite pride. The long answer is that one day, the erudite race decided that they'd finally had enough of the smooth-brained, mouth-breathing populace, so their leader, Erud, led an expedition to find an isolated home where their tall foreheads and massive egos could study the world in peace. Setting out from Kinos, they traveled across a quiet body of water, which was then named Erud's Crossing, and found such a place on the continent of Otis, where the only other halfway civilized occupants were a race of cat people called the Kirans. While they didn't exactly like their new visitors, they weren't technologically or magically advanced enough to do anything about it. So they remained in the south while the erudites settled in the north atop the Grand Plateau. Thus, the city of Erudin, named after their leader Erud, was built by the erudites. Again, massive egos. Things were well in the sparkling city for a time, until the erudite Miracle had a midlife crisis and became obsessed with unlocking the secret to immortality. For this, he called out to the dark gods, and Cazic-thule answered. Yes, Cazic-thule is doing things again. He does a lot of things. He shared the gift of necromancy with Miracle, giving him the potential of immortality through death, if he was strong and clever enough to master it. Miracle took this knowledge back to Erudin and shared his sinister discovery, hypothesizing that not only would he and his cohorts be able to live forever, but that they would be able to enslave the spirits themselves. Unsurprisingly, a sizable portion of the population didn't appreciate the dark arts, and forced those who did out of the very city that they had helped build, calling them Cazikites and Heretics. A mere 200 years after the founding of their city, the erudites broke into civil war, divided over the study of necromancy. During one of these bloody skirmishes, Erud himself was killed by the very people he had once led. In the wake of his death, the citizens of Erudin decided they'd had enough. Discarding their moral high ground, they leveled a deadly spell against the heretics' camp in Toxilia Forest. One that couldn't be blocked, and one that wouldn't leave a single survivor, intent on ending the war once and for all. The heretics sensed their impending demise and began crafting a response of their own. They knew the oncoming barrage couldn't be stopped, but it could be redirected. The erudites unleashed their attack in one of the greatest concentrations of magic that Norrath has ever seen, and the heretics responded in kind. Survivors described the collision of spells as earth-rending, an explosion that shook the very bones of the world, and a crashing energy that seemed as though it would tear a gash in the very sky. As the terrible magic faded, and the dust finally settled, it revealed a changed Otis. Erudin and the heretic city were untouched. However, there was a giant smoking crater where the Kiran city of Sharval had once been. As fun as it is to imagine that a magical explosion sent a mass of cat people and Earth flying through the stratosphere and careening into the moon, further study reveals that the collision of the two spells changed the nature of both. The magic morphed into a massive teleportation spell that ricocheted Sharval through the wizard towers, or as Al-Kabor calls them, quadriliths, and deposited the Vashir tribe of Kirans onto the moon of Luckland in a way that was actually survivable. The heretics saw the impressively deep hole left behind by the spell, And not being ones to pass on an opportunity for a new home, they trekked down into the pit and began construction of their own city, Paineel. During the construction, the heretics found that the force of the blast had gone so far down that it reached the living stone, a barrier Brel Cerulus himself created to keep his creations in the underfoot from invading Norrath. In typical arrogant erudite fashion, the heretics began experimenting with the divine energy of the living stone, planning to harness it and send earthquakes to Erudin until the city was reduced to dust. Instead, their tampering breached the barrier to the underfoot. Earth elementals flooded into the city of Paineel, quite literally crushing the heretic forces. They would have surged to the surface and continued their destructive path across Norrath, if not for the surprisingly selfless act of a wicked man. It was Darton of the Dark Truth, a knight of Cazic-thule, who stayed behind to contain the minions of the underfoot. He managed to create a magical hatch that repaired the break in the living stone, trapping himself behind it in the process. The heretics that managed to escape thanks to his sacrifice founded a new city, which they also named Paineel. They're just not very good at naming things, are they? From then on, the founding city was referred to as Old Paineel, but as travelers discovered the massive wound in the earth, it simply became known as the Hole. Being that erudites can never seem to leave well enough alone, and the fact that they'd left a ton of their artifacts and books behind in the evacuation, they once more tempted fate by researching how to open the very hatch that had saved them. They eventually discovered a blood ritual that would weaken the hatch long enough to temporarily open it, but it also weakened the blood donor, who usually became a victim of the monsters waiting right behind it. Some years later, this process was simplified to a magical key, one that the heretics would sell to naive adventurers who had no idea of the horrors that awaited them down in the hole. If you're wondering if the denizens of the underfoot ever have managed to escape, they have. All thanks to an egotistical little gnome who never learned from history and was thus doomed to repeat it. But that's a story for another day. Thanks for watching, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.